The transport ship landed at the Galactic Academy station with a hiss of pressure equalization. Katie Morrison pressed her face against the viewport and watched as dozens of alien species moved through the docking bay. Some walked on two legs like her, while others floated or crawled or moved in ways that made her head hurt if she thought about it too long. She had dreamed of this moment since she was 6 years old, reading stolen files from her mother's military computer. Behind her in the cargo section, Ember rumbled deep in his chest. The Red Dragon did not like confined spaces, and the 3-week journey from Earth had tested his patience. Spark was more adaptable as always. The Blue Dragon had spent most of the trip sleeping on top of the supply crates, occasionally waking to generate small electromagnetic fields that made the ship's navigation system complain. Katie grabbed her bag and headed to the cargo hold. A docking officer was already there, a tall mantis-like creature with too many joints in its arms. It held a data pad and was making clicking sounds that the universal translator turned into bureaucratic complaints. Apparently, dragons were not on the approved companion animal list. Neither were humans, for that matter, at least not until 3 months ago, when Earth had finally been granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council. She showed the officer her acceptance letter from the Academy. The document had 17 different holograms and seals that proved she had passed the entrance exams. What it did not mention was that she had scored higher than any applicant in the past 50 years, or that the testing committee had accused her of cheating until they made her retake everything under supervision. Humans were supposed to be primitive. They had only discovered faster than light travel by accident when a colony ship exploded in just the right way. The officer clicked some more, then waved her through. Katie opened the cargo door and Ember bounded out immediately. He spread his wings and released a jet of flame that made the docking bay sprinklers activate. Spark followed more calmly and wrapped himself around Katie's shoulders like a very large, scaly scarf. Several nearby aliens scrambled away from the dragons. One dropped its luggage and teleported to the other side of the bay. Katie scratched Ember behind his horn ridges and the dragon calmed down. She had raised both of them from eggs that she found in a cave system in Montana. The government scientists had wanted to take them for study, but Katie had already bonded with the hatchlings. Her mother, who was an admiral in the Space Force, had pulled enough strings to let her keep them. That was before the dragons learned to breathe fire and generate EMPs. After that, the military tried very hard to recruit all 3 of them. The Academy campus was even more impressive than the pictures. Crystal towers stretched up into the artificial sky of the station. Gardens filled with plants from 1,000 worlds created pockets of color between the buildings. Katie could see students moving between classes, and every one of them looked completely alien. She felt very small and very human and very aware that she was being stared at. Her dormitory was in the East Wing, reserved for species that needed oxygen-nitrogen atmospheres. The room was tiny, with a sleeping platform that was too short for her and a desk that was too tall. Ember took one look at the space and decided to sleep in the hallway. Spark claimed the desk as his personal territory. Katie unpacked her tools and her books and the small photo of her mother in uniform. She had 3 days before classes started. She spent those days exploring the campus and trying not to get lost. The Academy had buildings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. There were hallways that looped back on themselves and classrooms that were bigger on the inside than the outside. The cafeteria served food from 2,000 cultures, and Katie learned quickly that human taste buds were not compatible with most of it. She found a synthesizer that could make something close to pizza, and decided that would be her primary food source. Other students avoided her at first. Humans had a reputation for being unstable and violent. The fact that she had 2 dragons following her everywhere did not help. But Katie was used to being alone. She had spent her childhood being too smart for normal school and too young for university. The dragons were her only real friends, and they did not care that she could calculate orbital mechanics in her head or that she had memorized the periodic table of elements before she learned to ride a bike. On the 3rd day, she met another human. His name was Carlos, and he was studying xenobiology. He was older than her by 5 years and had been at the Academy for 2 semesters already. He warned her about Professor Zalthor, who taught advanced engineering. According to Carlos, the professor was brilliant, but had no patience for students he considered inferior.
He had failed entire classes before.
Several species had filed formal complaints about his teaching methods. Katie listened to the warning and then promptly forgot about it. She had not come to the academy to make friends or to avoid difficult teachers. She had come to learn everything the galaxy had to offer. Her first class was quantum mechanics, taught by a floating sphere of gas. Her second was alien materials science, taught by a rock creature that communicated through vibrations. Her third class was advanced engineering with Professor Zalthor. The professor was waiting when she entered the classroom. He stood 8 feet tall with silver scales that reflected the light in strange patterns. His 3 pairs of eyes tracked her movement as she found a seat in the back row. Ember and Spark settled at her feet and the other students edged away. Zalthor made a sound like grinding metal, and the universal translator converted it to a speech about standards and expectations and the honor of studying at the galaxy's finest institution. Katie pulled out her tablet and started taking notes. She had a feeling this was going to be interesting. Professor Zalthor did not believe in easy introductions. Within 5 minutes of starting his lecture, he had covered material that should have taken 3 weeks. He drew diagrams in the air using holographic projectors and spoke in technical terms that made the universal translator work overtime. Most of the students frantically took notes, trying to keep up. Katie just watched and listened and occasionally smiled when she recognized a concept from her independent study. The professor noticed her lack of panic. His middle pair of eyes focused on her while the other 2 continued scanning the room. He asked her a question about energy cascade failures in antimatter containment. It was the kind of question designed to embarrass students who were not paying attention. Katie answered without hesitation, explaining not just the failure mechanism but 3 ways to prevent it, including one method that involved deliberately inducing micro fractures in the containment field to distribute stress. Zalthor stared at her for a long moment. Then he asked another question, more difficult this time. Katie answered again. The third question was at a graduate level. She answered that too, and then asked her own question about whether anyone had tried using organic compounds instead of synthetic materials for containment fields. The professor told her it was impossible. Katie suggested he was wrong but did not push the issue. She could tell from the way his scales rippled that he was already annoyed. The rest of the class passed in tense silence. Other students kept glancing at Katie like she had just challenged a god to single combat. When the session ended, everyone filed out quickly. Carlos caught up with her in the hallway and asked if she had a death wish. Apparently no one questioned Zalthor, especially not in the first week. Katie shrugged and said she was just having a conversation. Ember growled softly as if to say that any professor who could not handle questions was not worth worrying about. The second week brought practical exercises. Students were divided into teams and given broken alien technology to repair. Katie ended up working with 3 other species, a slug-like creature that secreted acid, a bird thing with 4 wings, and a small robot that claimed to be a uploaded consciousness. None of them wanted to work with the human and her dragons, but they did not have a choice. Their assignment was to fix a Vorthon sensor array that had been damaged in a stellar storm. The device was the size of a small car and looked like someone had taken a crystal and convinced it to grow into impossible shapes. Katie immediately started taking it apart. Her teammates protested, but she ignored them. Within an hour, she had identified the problem of feedback loop in the quantum resonance chamber. The fix required recalibrating 17 components simultaneously. Her teammates said it was impossible. The calibration needed to happen within a microsecond window. No organic being had that kind of reaction time. Katie agreed, which was why she was going to let Spark do it. The dragon had been generating electromagnetic pulses since he was 3 months old. His control was precise enough to restart a human heart without causing damage. Recalibrating a sensor array would be easy. She spent 2 hours teaching Spark exactly what pulses to generate and when. The dragon learned quickly, as always. When she gave the signal, he released a cascade of perfectly timed electromagnetic bursts. The sensor array lit up and began humming. All 17 components synchronized. The bird creature made a chirping sound of amazement. The slug left a trail of impressed slime. Even the robot admitted it had not thought that would work. Professor Zalthor reviewed their work the next day. He examined the sensor array from every angle, ran diagnostics, and checked the calibration logs. Finally, he looked at Katie and asked how she had managed the timing. She explained about Spark. The professor said that using external tools was against the spirit of the exercise. Katie pointed out that the rules only said students could not use automated systems. Spark was not automated. He was her partner. The professor's scales turned a darker shade of silver, which Katie had learned meant he was angry. He told her that exploiting loopholes showed a lack of character. Katie responded that finding creative solutions showed adaptability. They stared at each other for several seconds. Ember raised his head and smoke drifted from his nostrils. Spark's wings crackled with building energy. The other students in the lab suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else. Zalthor gave them full marks for the assignment, but added a note to Katie's file about her attitude. She did not care. She had come to the academy to learn not to make friends with professors who thought there was only one right way to solve problems. Over the next few weeks, she continued to excel in her classes and continued to irritate Zalthor. She questioned his methods, suggested improvements to standard procedures, and generally acted like someone who had not been properly taught to fear authority. The other students started coming to her for help. Despite their initial fear of the dragons, they realized Katie actually knew what she was talking about. She could explain complex concepts in simple terms and had a talent for finding the easiest solution to difficult problems. Soon she was running informal study groups in her tiny dorm, room with Ember providing warmth on cold station, Knights and Spark occasionally helping with electrical, engineering problems. Carlos became her closest friend among the humans. He was fascinated by her dragons and spent hours studying their biology. According to him, they should not exist. Their ability to breathe fire violated at least 3 laws of thermodynamics, and their electromagnetic generation made no sense given their organic structure. Katie told him that Earth was full of things that did not make sense. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for a few months. There was probably a lot about her planet that would surprise the other species. Professor Zalthor continued to make his classes as difficult as possible. He assigned projects that should have taken weeks and expected them done in days. He gave exams that covered material he had barely mentioned in lectures. He seemed particularly focused on making Katie fail, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. She worked harder than everyone else, stayed up later, studied more, and still found time to help her classmates. The dragons watched over her during those long nights and occasionally forced her to take breaks when she pushed herself too hard. Then came the practical examination that would change everything. Students were required to disassemble and reassemble a Vorthan power core without triggering its fail-safe mechanisms. It was considered one of the hardest tests in the advanced engineering program. The power cores were notoriously sensitive, and one mistake could cause them to lock down permanently. Several students had failed this exact test in previous years, including some who went on to have successful careers elsewhere. Katie looked at the power core on her workstation and smiled. This was going to be fun. The examination hall was filled with nervous energy. 30 students sat at workstations, each with an identical Vorthan power core in front of them. Professor Zalthor stood at the front of the room with his 3 pairs of eyes tracking every movement. He explained the rules in his grinding metal voice. They had 2 hours to complete the task. Any student who triggered the failsafe would receive an automatic failure and would have to retake the entire course. Katie pulled out her tools. She had a standard academy toolkit, plus a few items she had brought from Earth. A magnetic screwdriver her mother had given her. A diagnostic scanner she had built herself from spare parts. A small hammer that had no business being in an advanced engineering lab, but Katie had found it useful for percussive maintenance. Ember and Spark settled on either side of her workstation. Other students glanced nervously at the dragons, but no one complained. Everyone was too focused on their own work. She started by running a complete diagnostic on the power core. Most students would skip this step and go straight to disassembly, but Katie wanted to understand what she was working with. The scanner showed her the energy flow patterns, the stress points in the containment matrix, and a small irregularity in the quantum stabilizer that should not have been there. It was a manufacturing defect so minor that most engineers would never notice it. Katie made a note and continued her scan. Around her, other students began carefully removing the outer casing of their power cores. The devices were designed to be maintained in the field, so disassembly was theoretically straightforward. The problem was that Vorthan technology was incredibly precise. Every component had to be removed in exactly the right order and handled with exactly the right amount of force. Too rough and you could damage the containment field. Too gentle and you might not fully disengage the connection points. Katie worked with steady confidence. She had spent the last 3 weeks studying Vorthan engineering in the academy library. She knew these power cores better than most Vorthons did. Her hands moved quickly but carefully, removing components and laying them out in a precise grid pattern, so she would know exactly where everything went during reassembly. Ember watched her work with lazy interest. Spark had fallen asleep with his head on her backpack. She finished disassembly in 40 minutes. Professor Zalthor walked past her station and paused. He studied her work, looking for any mistake that would justify marking her down. The components were arranged perfectly. Her tools were clean and organized. Even her workspace was neater than most of the other students. He made a note on his datapad and moved on without comment. Katie allowed herself a small smile. Now came the interesting part. She had disassembled the power core faster than required, which meant she had time to actually look at how it worked. The energy distribution system was efficient but not optimal. The Vorthons had designed it to be stable and reliable, which made sense for a species that valued safety over performance. But Katie could see 3 ways to improve the output without compromising stability. She pulled out her personal toolkit, the one she was not supposed to have in the exam hall. Inside were components she had fabricated in the academy workshop during late-night sessions when no one was paying attention. A modified capacitor array, a custom resonance chamber, a small processing unit that she had programmed herself. If she integrated these into the power core, she could increase efficiency by at least 15%, maybe more. Katie knew this was not part of the test. She was supposed to reassemble the core exactly as it had been disassembled, but she had never been good at following instructions that did not make sense. If she could make the technology better, why should she leave it worse? She started modifying the core. Her modifications were careful and reversible. If anyone objected, she could put everything back the way it was. Probably. Spark woke up and watched what she was doing. The dragon made a questioning chirp. Katie scratched his chin and whispered that everything was fine. Ember raised his head and sniffed the air. He could smell the ozone from the active power core, and it made him nervous. Katie gave him a reassuring pat and continued working. She was integrating the human components with alien technology, and the results were fascinating. The problem was that human and Vorthon engineering used completely different principles. Humans built things to be adaptable and easy to repair. Vorthons built things to last forever without maintenance. Getting the 2 approaches to work together required some creative problem-solving. Katie ended up using a hybrid connection system that could translate between the different energy signatures. It was elegant and efficient and absolutely not standard procedure. She was so focused on her work that she did not notice Professor Zalthor approaching until his shadow fell across her workstation. She looked up and saw all 3 pairs of his eyes fixed on her modified power core. His scales had turned almost black with anger. The entire room went quiet. Other students stopped working and watched. This was either going to be very impressive or very bad. The professor reached down and picked up the modified core with one scaled hand. He examined it closely, turning it over to see all the changes Katie had made. His jaw moved in a way that the universal translator converted to extremely formal and extremely angry language. He said that she had violated testing protocols. She had used unauthorized components. She had modified academy property without permission. She had demonstrated a complete lack of respect for established procedures. Katie tried to explain that she had improved the efficiency. Zalthor did not want to hear it. He said that improvement was not the point. Following instructions was the point. Understanding her limitations was the point. She was a human barely advanced enough to be allowed in the academy, and she was treating Vorthon technology like a toy. He continued lecturing, getting louder with each sentence. Several students from species with sensitive hearing covered their ear equivalents. Then he made his mistake. In his species, striking a student on the head was a mild correction. It was meant to refocus attention, to remind them of their place in the hierarchy. It was not intended to cause harm. But Professor Zalthor was angry and not thinking clearly. His hand moved fast and struck Katie across the side of her head hard enough to knock her backward into her chair. The room exploded into chaos. Ember roared and released a jet of flame that set off every fire suppression system in the building. Spark generated an electromagnetic pulse that made half the power cores in the room shut down. Students scrambled away from the dragons. Several ran for the exits. One teleported away so fast they left a scorch mark on the floor. Alarms started blaring throughout the entire wing of the academy. Katie sat in her chair and touched her cheek where Zalthor had hit her. Her ear was ringing and she could taste blood, but she was not crying. She was not scared. She was thinking. Her eyes had gone cold and calculating in the way they did when she was solving a particularly difficult problem. She looked at the professor standing there with his hand still raised, and she made a decision. She stood up slowly, grabbed her tools, and walked toward him with the kind of calm that was somehow more terrifying than any amount of anger could have been. The fire suppression systems had turned the examination hall into a cold, wet mess. Water dripped from the ceiling and pooled on the floor. Most of the students had evacuated. A few brave ones remained pressed against the far walls, watching to see what would happen next. Professor Zalthor stood frozen as Katie Morrison walked toward him, with a small device in her hand that looked like a cross between a medical scanner and a wrench. She gestured for him to open his mouth. The professor stared at her in confusion. The universal translator was having trouble processing what was happening, because nothing in his cultural database prepared him for a student casually approaching after being struck. In his species, the matter would have been settled. The student would have accepted the correction and moved on. But humans apparently did things differently. Katie waited patiently. Ember and Spark had calmed down slightly, though both dragons were still watching Zalthor with eyes that promised terrible things if he made another wrong move. The remaining students whispered among themselves, trying to guess what the tiny human was planning. Carlos, who had been taking the exam in the back row, pushed through the crowd to get a better view. He had seen Katie solve impossible problems before, but this seemed different. Finally, curiosity overcame pride, and Zalthor opened his jaw. Katie stepped closer, completely unafraid of the being who was more than 3 feet taller than her. She examined his mouth with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years studying biology and engineering in equal measure. Her scanner beeped softly as it analyzed the bone structure and muscle attachments. She made small humming sounds that suggested she was finding exactly what she expected to find. After 4 seconds of examination, she pulled out the wrench-like device. It had several adjustable components and a small screen that displayed information Katie could read, but no one else could see. She reached into Zalthor's mouth with both hands, working with the kind of precision that came from training dragons to accept medical care. Her fingers found something near the back of his jaw, and she began making tiny adjustments. The professor felt a click, then a slight pressure, then suddenly a sensation he had never experienced before. His jaw moved in ways it never had. The chronic ache that had been present for 30 years just vanished. The slight grinding sound that occurred when he spoke disappeared. Even his breathing felt easier. Katie stepped back, wiped her tools on her uniform, and looked up at him with an expression that was almost innocent. She asked if rewiring a professor's jaw was going to be on the final exam. Her tone was conversational, like she had just helped him with a minor technical problem, rather than performing impromptu surgery. The remaining students erupted in sounds that ranged from laughter to shock, depending on their species. Carlos started clapping, and several others joined in. Even the students who had been most afraid of Katie seemed impressed by her absolute fearlessness. Professor Zalthor touched his jaw with one scaled hand. He opened and closed it several times, marveling at the smooth movement. He had been to doctors on his homeworld. They had told him the jaw misalignment was genetic and untreatable. They had given him pain medication and told him to live with it. A human child had fixed it in less than a minute using tools she probably built in a dorm room. He looked at Katie with new understanding. She was not reckless. She was not disrespectful. She was simply operating at a level he had not recognized. When she modified the power core, she had not been showing off. She had genuinely seen a way to make it better, and could not understand why anyone would object to improvement. When she questioned his teaching methods, she had not been challenging his authority. She had been trying to learn. The realization made him feel very old and very foolish. He asked her how she knew about his jaw. Katie shrugged and said she had noticed the way he moved it when he spoke. The slight favor he gave to one side, the tension in the muscles. She had seen similar issues in humans and had read about comparative alien anatomy in the library. The fix was simple once you understood the underlying structure. Zalthor asked why she had not mentioned it before. Katie pointed out that walking up to your professor and offering to rewire his face was probably not appropriate classroom behavior. The academy administration arrived 10 minutes later. They were not happy about the fire suppression activation, or the electromagnetic pulse that had damaged equipment throughout the wing. They wanted explanations, and they wanted someone to blame. Professor Zalthor stepped forward and took full responsibility. He said there had been a misunderstanding about proper student interaction, and that he would be filing a formal apology. The administrators looked confused but accepted his statement. Katie was ordered to report to the dean's office. She went with Ember and Spark following close behind. The dragons were still agitated and left scorch marks on the floor wherever they walked. Students pressed themselves against the walls to let them pass. By the time Katie reached the administrative wing, half the academy had heard about what happened. The other half heard about it in the next 10 minutes. Humans were already known for being unpredictable, but this was something else entirely. The dean was a floating crystalline structure that communicated through light patterns. It asked Katie to explain her actions. She did so calmly and clearly. She described the test, the modifications she had made, the professor's reaction, the strike. Her decision to help him anyway because fixing things was what she did. The dean pulsed with colors that indicated it was processing complex ethical calculations. Finally, it ruled that both Katie and Professor Zalthor had violated academy protocols. Katie for unauthorized modification of equipment, Zalthor for inappropriate physical contact with a student. However, given the unusual circumstances and the fact that no permanent harm had been done, both would receive warnings rather than suspensions. Katie was also ordered to remove all unauthorized components from the power core and complete her examination under supervision. She returned to the examination hall 2 hours later. The other students had finished their tests and left. Only Professor Zalthor remained sitting at the front of the room with her modified power core on the desk beside him. He had been studying it, trying to understand how she had integrated the human and Vorthon technologies. When Katie entered, he stood, and for the first time since they had met, he treated her as an equal, rather than a primitive. He told her the modifications were brilliant. The efficiency improvement was even better than she had claimed. 17% increase in output with no loss of stability. He had run every test he could think of, and the hybrid system performed perfectly. Then he told her to take it all apart and reassemble the core exactly as it had been. Academy rules were academy rules. Katie nodded and got to work. She completed the standard reassembly in 30 minutes. Professor Zalthor marked her exam as passed with the highest grade he had given in 5 years. Then he asked if she would be interested in independent research. The academy had workshops where advanced students could pursue their own projects. He could sponsor her application. She could work on whatever interested her as long as she documented her methods and shared her findings. Katie agreed immediately. As she left the examination hall with her dragons, Zalthor called after her. He said that she had taught him something important today, that sometimes the best solutions came from those who did not know something was supposed to be impossible. Katie smiled and said that was the most human thing she had heard anyone say. Then she headed back to her dorm to start planning her first independent project. She had some ideas about hybrid engines that she wanted to explore. Behind her, Professor Zalthor touched his jaw again and smiled. It was going to be an interesting semester. News of the incident spread through the academy faster than light travel. By the next morning, every student knew about the human girl who had rewired a professor's jaw after being struck. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions claimed she had 50 dragons. Others said she could fix anything with just a wrench and attitude. A few insisted she had threatened to disassemble Zalthor completely if he ever hit a student again. None of these versions were accurate, but Katie did not bother correcting them. Her new reputation had interesting effects. Students who had avoided her before now sought her out for help with their projects. Professors who had dismissed her as a primitive human started actually listening when she asked questions in class. Even the academy administration seemed more willing to accommodate her unusual needs, like letting Ember sleep in the hallway and allowing Spark to sit in on advanced electrical engineering, lectures where his natural abilities made him better than most of the equipment. Professor Zalthor became her most vocal supporter. He vouched for her when she applied for advanced courses that were normally restricted to species with 3 times her lifespan. He defended her when other professors complained about her tendency to modify their assignments. He even helped her set up a proper workshop where she could work on her projects without triggering quite so many safety alarms. The workshop became Katie's favorite place on the station. It was located in a quiet corner of the engineering wing with enough space for her tools, her dragons, and whatever project she was currently obsessed with. She spent hours there most days working on her hybrid engine concept. The idea was simple in theory. Combine human adaptability with alien precision to create a propulsion system that was both efficient and easy to maintain. The execution was far more complicated, requiring her to integrate at least 7 different technological approaches. Carlos helped when he could, though his expertise was biology rather than engineering. He was fascinated by how Katie thought. She approached problems sideways, finding connections that no one else saw. When she got stuck on the energy distribution problem, she spent 2 days studying how spark generated electromagnetic pulses. When she needed a better cooling system, she analyzed how Ember regulated his internal temperature to breathe fire without burning himself. Nature had already solved most engineering problems if you knew where to look. The hybrid engine took 6 months to build. Katie worked through meals and often fell asleep at her workstation with her head on a pile of notes. Ember and Spark took turns watching over her and occasionally dragging her back to her dorm when she pushed herself too far. The dragons had grown larger during their time at the academy. Ember was now the size of a small spacecraft, and Spark could generate enough electricity to power an entire building. Other students had stopped being afraid of them and started treating them like beloved but dangerous mascots. When Katie finally completed the engine, she ran tests for a week straight. The results exceeded every expectation. The hybrid design was 40% more efficient than standard Academy propulsion systems. It could operate on multiple fuel types. It was simple enough that any mechanic could repair it with basic tools. Most importantly, it was stable. No matter what Katie threw at it, the engine kept running smoothly. She documented everything and prepared to present her findings. The presentation was scheduled for the end-of-semester showcase, where advanced students demonstrated their projects. Katie was nervous in a way she rarely felt. This was not about grades or proving herself to professors. This was about showing the galaxy that human engineering could contribute something valuable. She wore her best uniform, which still had grease stains that would not come out. Ember and Spark accompanied her to the presentation hall and only set fire to 2 chairs, which everyone agreed was remarkably restrained. The hall was filled with students, professors, and several members of the Galactic Council who had come to evaluate the Academy's research programs. Katie stood at the front with her hybrid engine on display and began explaining her work. She kept it simple, using basic terms and clear examples. She showed the efficiency data. She demonstrated the ease of maintenance. She explained how combining different technological philosophies could produce results better than either approach alone. The questions started immediately. A Vorthan engineer asked how she had solved the energy cascade problem. Katie explained about learning from Spark. A crystalline mathematician wanted to know about her stress distribution calculations. Katie showed her work, which involved some very creative uses of geometry. Professor Zalthor asked if the design could be scaled up for larger vessels. Katie said she did not see why not, though it would require more testing. Then a council member asked the question everyone was thinking. Why had no one thought of this before? Katie considered her answer carefully. She said that sometimes the best solutions came from not knowing something was supposed to be impossible. Most engineers had been trained to think in specific ways. They followed established procedures and built on existing knowledge. That was good and necessary. But sometimes progress required someone who did not know the rules well enough to be limited by them. The council member, a floating sphere, covered in sensor arrays pulsed with what Katie had learned to recognize as approval. It said that humans had only been part of the galactic community for a few months, but they were already challenging assumptions that had been held for centuries. Perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy needed. Fresh perspectives from a species that had learned to thrive on a dangerous world through adaptation and innovation. The other council members indicated agreement. Katie received the highest honors for her project. Several companies offered her internships. 3 different research institutions wanted to hire her. The Galactic Council itself suggested she might be interested in joining their advanced technology division after graduation. She politely declined everything. She still had 3 years left at the academy, and she wanted to learn as much as possible before making any commitments. Besides, she had ideas for at least a dozen more projects. The celebration that night involved students from 200 species gathering in the main courtyard. Someone had set up music that was supposed to be universally appealing, but mostly just sounded like random noise. Katie did not mind. She sat with Carlos and her dragons and watched as beings who had nothing in common except their love of learning danced and celebrated together. This was why she had come to the academy. Not for grades or recognition, but to be part of something larger than herself. Professor Zalthor found her near the end of the celebration. He sat down, which was unusual for his species. His scales had turned a lighter silver that indicated contentment. He told her that teaching her had changed his perspective. He had spent 200 cycles believing that experience and tradition were the most important things. She had shown him that curiosity and creativity mattered just as much. He thanked her for that lesson, even if it had come with some chaos along the way. Katie asked about his jaw. He said it still worked perfectly. No pain, no grinding, no problems at all. Several colleagues from his homeworld had asked about the procedure after seeing how well he moved now. Katie offered to write up her technique so Zalthor's species could benefit from it. He accepted gratefully. Then he asked what she planned to work on next. Katie grinned and started describing an idea about quantum processors that could integrate organic components. It sounded impossible, which meant it was exactly the kind of project she would love. As the celebration wound down, Katie returned to her dorm with Ember and Spark. The dragons curled up in their usual spots and fell asleep immediately. Katie sat at her desk and looked at the photo of her mother. She thought about sending a message home, but Earth was weeks away, even with fast communication. Instead, she wrote in her journal about the hybrid engine and the presentation, and how strange it felt to be recognized for doing what came naturally to her. She thought about the years ahead. More classes, more projects, more opportunities to learn from species that had been exploring the stars for thousands of years. She thought about the friends she had made and the professors who had learned to respect her despite their initial doubts. She thought about how far humanity had come in such a short time, and how far they still had to go. Most of all, she thought about the look on Zalthor's face when she had asked if rewiring his jaw would be on the final exam. Katie smiled and closed her journal. Tomorrow she would start working on the quantum processor project. Tonight she would sleep, knowing that she had proved something important. Humans might be small and their technology might look primitive, but underestimating them was a mistake the galaxy would only make once. And her dragons, well, they were just happy to be included in whatever chaos came next. That was enough.